Back with you tonight, you're in Focus. Thanks for staying on. Student debt has continued to climb in recent years from 11.3 billion rands to now sitting at 16.5 billion rands between the 2018 and 2020 period. But insiders fear South Africa's graduates may find themselves exposed to financial challenges later in life. This, as more than half the student population is supported by the government's NSFAS scheme. Current economic conditions and ever-rising the cost of living are causing a significant concern. Joining us now to share their views on how this could be tackled are University of South Africa Head of Operations, Dr. Meyer, and the South African Student Union spokesperson, Asive Dlanjwa. And we're taking your thoughts on 072-110-5584. What would it take to solve the national student debt crisis? You can weigh in on that conversation tonight. Good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time and for joining us tonight here on In Focus. Asive, let's begin with you. The possibility of a state-sponsored write-off of the debt seemingly grabs headlines as something that could possibly be explored. But experts are saying that there is really no single policy to solve this problem because it would not be dealing with the root causes of the nation's 16.5 billion rands student debt crisis. What are the root causes?
Good evening, Chabo, and also good evening to Dr. Linda and the rest of your viewers. Chabo, I think government needs to underwrite the writing off of student debt of our students for many reasons. Number one, the reality is that the majority of the students that find themselves with the student debt that is amounting to at least around about 16 billion rand is that majority of them are students that entered the sector before 2018, and this was before there was at least the threshold for NSFAS was 350,000. Number one. And number two, the reality is that the access to higher education is directly linked to the development of the country, the socio-economic development of the country. And thus, education becomes a public good. It is in all our interests, it is in the interest of the state, it is the interest of our communities that all of us are able to write off that student debt, because up until we're able to do that, one of the things that student debt has led to, Thabo, has been a high dropout rate, because students have to go and take up other jobs while having to maintain their studies. And as a matter of fact, these students have dropped out. And for as long as they carry on to drop out, it means that they will not be able to get themselves out of the clutches of poverty. They will not be able to get their communities out of the clutches of poverty, but also they will not be able to contribute back into the economy. So it makes all the economic sense that the student debt be written off by government, as also some of the students have already qualified. Yeah. So we think it is absolutely crucial that student debt be written off, because we believe that it will have a direct positive impact on the turnaround of the economy, but also contribute into the broader socio-economic development of the country.
It may be the answer on day one, but it's not the answer on day two, when more students come and, again, the same problem is experienced and more debt is accumulated.
No, that won't be an issue, Thabo, because for a few reasons. Number one is that more or less about 90% of households now in South Africa qualify to be funded by NSFAS. Although we appreciate that it's just, I think, above 50% of students that are currently in the sector that are funded by NSFAS. So that won't be an issue, because what we are dealing with here is a backlog of students that a lot of them entered the system before 2018. So as time progresses, obviously, as I say, more or less about 90% of households in South Africa qualify. Number one. Number two, why I don't think that will be an issue is that we are currently in talks with the government, and we are hoping that they will heed our call. In fact, it's some of our suggestions which we believe will deal with this issue of student debt, and that also speaks to increasing that 350,000 rand threshold, and then at the point at which we stop, it could be 500,000 or whatever, and then all the way up. In fact, our submission was that we increase that all the way up to 600,000 per annum, But to the extent to which we're able to afford that, then we are saying from that point onwards, we must have a loan guarantee system, zero loan guarantee system,
yes.
Particularly for students that are doing their postgraduate studies.
Right.
So obviously we'll still have some level of debt, particularly for students that are doing postgraduate studies, which is once again why we are appealing to government that we need to begin to fund more postgraduate degrees, because this is also where we are getting a lot of student debt coming from, because they are only funded for their first degrees, and the reality is that for some professions, an undergraduate qualification is insufficient for them to be able to work and to qualify in their respective fields. And as a matter of fact, for their honors and masters, etc., they would rake up this student debt. So we think if government comes to the party, as we are hoping they will, that we should not have a problem moving onwards. But obviously, we have 16 billion rand that we need to deal with now. We are not going to say we're not going to deal with this 16 billion rand because of what could potentially happen in the next 10 years. We've got a 16 billion rand that we must deal with. We've got students that need to participate in the economy and remove themselves and their families and their communities out of the clutches of poverty. So we need to make that intervention.
Dr. Linda, let's bring you into the conversation. Are student loans still the main access tool for students to get a qualification? And therefore, would a debt write-off be the answer to solving what we are looking at here as a student debt crisis? By the way, not unique to South Africa, even developed nations. In fact, the biggest amount of student debt is actually in the United States.
Yes, indeed. And good evening to Asive, my dear colleague. I think the issues, we agree on many of the issues with SARS. What we are saying is that government needs to find the money and reprioritize to be able to pay this debt. The debt is at 16.5 billion at the end of the 2020 audited financials. So we can estimate that it is really and has escalated in the region of 18 billion rand. Now, if we look at this particular debt encumberment, for universities it means that they have to service this debt and to the tune of 1.2 billion, which is detracting from the academic program. And secondly, what this means in real terms is that 120,000 of our students have been unable to graduate from universities. And we always say, you know, the facts really speak for themselves. If we look at the unemployment rate of youth, it is 63.9%, as we know, for the first quarter in 2022. But if we look at the graduate unemployment rates for degree graduates, it's only at 12.5%, and for diplomas at 23.2%. So really, there is no debate around whether this is an investment that needs to be made by government to turn around the economy and to present the required skills. But certainly government needs to find this money because it's putting universities in a very precarious position in terms of cash flow. But secondly, it really is an impediment on students that have invested many years of their studies and are now unable to graduate because of this historic debt that they are carrying.
It is argued, though, that government is already giving universities a whole lot of money via the subsidies that are afforded to them. Are the institutions profiteering on these students' loans?
Not at all. So tuition fees, which is paid by students, makes up 33% of university fees. Government grants make up 44% of government fees, and third stream revenue makes up 23% of university operating budgets. So certainly universities are not in this for profit. Many of them, struggle to make budgets meet at the end of every year. So this is a systemic challenge that we must address. So the historic debt is one element. The second is that we bring sustainability and policy certainty so that there is a different scheme that is available to students that do not qualify for NSFAS. And we're looking within our universities at missing middle students, which make up across the sector approximately 20% of our student population, and is still the cohort of students that are detrimentally affected in most instances.
So the argument is make higher education more affordable. In other words, here's what needs to happen. Universities need to decrease their fees because wages have not kept up with the rising costs of tertiary education. Reduce the fees at universities. Even with the reduced fees, students would still need to take up debt because, as Asive has already pointed out, it's not just the tuition fees, but it's also the living costs that they will need to fund. Where are the universities sitting on that argument?
So the issue is, obviously, we've seen that universities' operating expenses include salary increases every year. It increases on a number of operational expenditures, electricity, water. Those things are not free, and universities are not exempted from those costs and taxes that need to be paid. So certainly their fees go up annually. When we speak about decreasing fees to universities, we need to start speaking about the academic project and what it is that we're seeing and saying. Is it that we're saying that academics need to be paid less? Is it that we're saying we need to invest less in the resources that are available to our students? So it is a very complex discussion that we need to have, because everything would be a trade-off. If there's less money, we're going to have to take from one area to give to another. Universities don't make profits, and that is not their intention to do that. But certainly where we can optimize efficiencies, we certainly need to see where that will be possible.
And the question then of how you manage the debt. I mean, some institutions patting themselves on the shoulder in terms of how they are managing the debt, but part of how these institutions manage the debt is by listing students. A call is being made that students especially should not be enrolled with credit bureaus, especially just after finishing their degrees.
Yes, and certainly, to my knowledge, there is not a university that takes that as a course of action to report students so that they get a negative credit rating, because this impacts on their future trajectory of being able to be employed within the market. And certainly we don't want fees to increase, but the money needs to come from somewhere. So we need this coherent, integrated policy to see how resourcing is aligned, how it is allocated to universities. But really, systemically, we need to find a solution to student funding mechanisms within South Africa. We see in Australia, if somebody leaves, if they immigrate, they're required to pay back the money that government has invested in their education. And we are awaiting the government's policy framework, which should have been released in October, and we're hopeful, will be released in October, but we are hopeful that we'll have preliminary drafts, and we're hoping that there will be income contingency loans, that there will be different mechanisms that are being put on the table so that students have financial security, and that they are not academic exclusions and financial exclusions in universities are minimized, so that the impact on the student population really is not in the manner that it currently is detrimental to many, many students.
All right, let's take a break. Asive, I saw your hand. We're going to come to you and get you to respond to some of those issues and taking your thoughts as well. 072-110-5584. What would it take to solve the student debt crisis? We're back discussing that ever-thorny issue of the national student debt crisis. Dr. Linda Meyer, Head of Operations at the Universities South Africa, and Student Union spokesperson Asive Dlanjwa. So, Asive, it's a multi-pronged approach that many are suggesting, and I think that's what you're calling for as well. But first, it starts with the fact that our parents' wages have not kept up with the rising cost of tertiary education. So unless fees are decreased and students are given interest-free debt, and maybe NSFAS is expanded to even cover living expenses, this particular issue of debt will not be solved. It will continue to be with us. And the universities are saying, no, we can't do that because, I mean, that would certainly impact on the academic program and the research and all the work that universities would need to do. They also are paying salaries, so it will also impact on the salaries of the staff as well.
Thabo, that is where I think we will disagree with USAF and their affiliates at the universities. We think there is room to decrease fees without compromising the academic project and the integrity of our academic output. The reality of the matter is that the majority of those vice-chancellors are getting paid, some of them, more than double what the president of the country is getting paid. And yet they are presiding over institutions that are failing and over institutions that are five to being placed under administration and institutions that are being placed under administration. There is absolutely no conceivable reason why you would pay an academic 6 million rand to preside over 20,000 students. It does not make sense. And this is what is happening. There is enough room to decrease fees, and there is enough room to decrease the salaries of university executives. What they are getting paid is absolutely just ridiculous, and in fact there is nothing about the performances of the institutions that suggests that they should be getting paid as much. You can't have because these are public institutions that we are speaking about. It's not private AfriForum institutions. These are public institutions. Why would a government, why would a minister be paid and a president be paid 50%, 40% less than what a vice-chancellor who's presiding over one campus is getting? It does not make sense. So there is enough room for that, number one. Number two, there is room for us to be able to raise funds. One of them is the private sector. The private sector is not contributing as much as they should be. In fact, we actually believe that there are probably some of of all the stakeholders across the value chain, there are probably some of the most lackluster and less interested as the party, because we have long called on government to say that you need to be able to tax the private sector more as far as education is concerned, because we appreciate that education is a public good. The same way that everyone is taxed to use the roads, that everyone is taxed to use all other public amenities, it is the same with education. The people that work in these institutions and in these businesses come from these institutions. So it only makes sense that the private sector needs to be able to put in. It cannot be that the private sector is funding higher education out of a morality issue, or they must feel inspired, or they must dream about it. It does not make sense. We need to legislate and create a framework such that we are able to get as much as we are able to from the private sector, much like we are from the public sector. One thing is guaranteed, Thabo, is this, is that the parents, as you rightfully say, they do not have the money because they are being retrenched. Beyond the fact that they are being retrenched, the reality is that we are probably facing the worst economic crisis that we have faced as a country since the dawn of democracy, number one. Number two, the reality is that obviously based on an ailing economy, the priorities of government will also be affected. So meaning that one thing we know for a fact is that, yes, we believe that government should reprioritize, and we do not believe that they are prioritizing education as much as they should. Number one. Number two, as I've already said, that the parents cannot afford. So who else now? It is the employer and the private sector. They must be able to bring more. We must not wait for them to fund higher education through CSI projects. They must be paying tax directly to fund higher education. And we will be able to deal with this issue. And then, Thabo, and it also speaks to this. I do not know how much time you have, but it would be very wrong and amiss of me not to raise this point. We want to, because it is tied directly to what we are speaking about, we want to condemn in the strongest possible terms the brutalization and the victimization of student leaders in universities, because these students have been victimized particularly because of the inaffordability of higher education and the systematic exclusion tactics that have been used by institutions using the increasing their fees to be able to exclude students. What am I speaking about? A few days ago, 7 SRC students, including the president and the SG of the SRC in UP, were suspended. Why were they suspended? Because they were protesting against a 100% increase in registration fees in the next 2 years, meaning that the students will not be able to even get through the doors, let alone student debt. They will not even be able to get through the doors of higher learning because registration would have been increased by 100%. And then those students are being suspended. We must condemn this behavior. It speaks to what we have been speaking about, Thabo, even the last time I was here, that universities are enjoying unchecked power through this elusive institutional autonomy, where they can behave and act outside the prevalent socio-economic conditions that we are facing in the country. And number one, and number two, that it really appears that we are being led by thugs and amapara who are masquerading as academics, because why would any right-thinking academic in an institution of higher learning increase registration fees when the economy is at its worst by 100%? It does not make sense that to us. And also, why would you suspend the whole SRC when you appreciate that the governance fundamentals and principles of governance and institution of higher learning require student participation? These are the things that we are dealing with, and all these things are connected, and we must condemn these universities. And I must plead also with the Linda to say that many institutions have been taking this route of suspending its student leaders, and we are not going to accept it. We have 4 institutions that have currently suspended their students because they are fighting for their students who cannot afford to study in their institutions. So I think it is important for us to register this concern.
All right. Now, that's a conversation we're going to have also, that of the suspension of student leaders. I want us to zoom in again on this question of debt, and I know you're saying they're related. Dr. Linda Meyer, who owns a majority of the student debt? Asive raises the question of private sector. Is it sitting in the hands of banks or the universities themselves owning a majority of the student debt?
So the projected 7 billion rand that we currently have, and really anticipating that it might be more than that, but the 17 billion rand is in the hands of universities. So it's fees that are owed by students directly to universities. And this excludes students, obviously, that owe financial institutions money for study loans, private loans that have been taken by parents, by employers. So this, this problem, we don't have empirical research to rely on, but this problem systemically might be much larger than we have statistics for or that we even comprehend.
Yeah, and so we're not going to find ourselves in a situation where government is giving this money to universities and it's going straight into the hands of financial institutions.
No, what we would ask, obviously, is that government needs to pay the money into students' accounts so that their accounts can be neutralized, so that they have zero balances. Because this is what is preventing students from graduating. It is the costs that, universities have operating costs. So when they don't receive these fees tuition fees from students, they have to find the money from somewhere else. They have to borrow that money to make their balance their budgets.
And if government is to then consider this idea of a debt write-off, because as you say, this is something that universities cannot do themselves without the government buy-in, what would be the criteria? Right? There are some who, for example, say whenever these programs are considered, there is a lot of red tape. Rate of acceptance, for example, of poor black students is quite low. Who qualifies, and how would that criteria be determined?
Well, certainly there would have to be some measure and criterion that is being set. We must also remember that 50% of our students, just over 50% of our students, owe less than 25,000 rand, which means that if that 25,000 rand across the board was paid, already we would see that half of the student debt would be dealt with. So the incomes and the means test that is done by universities in terms of households is not necessarily the quantum that we can apply, because we must understand that NSFAS students are from poor and working class families, but the cutoff is 350,000 Rand for them to qualify. And this amount does not go up with CPI annually. So really, households are getting poorer, and the CPI needs to be applied to NSFAS eligibility so that there is greater sustainability and certainty within the system.
Right, 072-110-5584. Here are your comments tonight to this conversation. Asive, I put this one to you. Let NSFAS work hand in hand with SARS to trace the benefited culprits to pay back the money. This will enable it to fund more students in the future. I still admire how SARS approaches things. That's Leonard in Mahike. And Dr. Sipho Ngongwane is saying, good evening, Thabo, and the panelists, as well as the viewers. Do SETAs not have billions? Why should the money which SETAs have not be used to pay off the current student debt? To what extent do foundations assist the students' population in attaining their junior degrees? Thanks. Asive?
Thank you, Thabo. Number one, I'm not sure the viewer who are they referring to in terms of SARS, because we've got a few. For instance, we've got students that would have unduly benefited based on the fact that they did not necessarily qualify, and SARS has had to do some work. Or are they referring to students who were in fact funded in the past? And if it is students who are funded in the past, it's exactly what we are speaking about, that they cannot afford to pay back that debt, and therefore that debt must be written off. I think that this is the point that we are raising, as Linda is saying, that the standard of living, or rather the income that is the disposable income that is at home, in fact, if anything, it does not remain stagnant, but its buying power keeps on decreasing, while university fees keep on skyrocketing. So I do not think those students should be able to pay it back. And as far as SETAs have been concerned, I think they have done. They have funded quite a lot of students. Obviously, we will know that it has not been without challenges, particularly as it pertains to corruption. There's been a lot of corruption in that space, which is also undermining once again the ability of those institutions to be able to fund as many students as they possibly can. So yes.
Yeah. Do you have a solution as the students, as the universities are saying, we are sitting with this debt, we own majority of this debt? It's students across the board that probably are owing 25,000 or less. Do you have suggestions on how the repayment system could be reformed?
No, Thabo, we are not advocating for a repayment system. There is no repayment system that will make them have the money to be able to pay back those fees. And number two, there's no repayment system that will make it any easier to pay that amount of money. We are saying that based on what we have established to be the benefits of the students entering the work market, is that the government must write off those debts. Those debts have to be written off through the private one. Universities can find the money to write off some of that debt. One of those includes, but not limited to them, a trimming of salaries of executives, number one. Number two, government can definitely put in more money in terms of writing off that student debt. And number three, the private sector will maintain still as a role to play in writing off that student debt. The students are not going to have that money. Whether you say they must repay it in 2 years, in 3 years, or repay it in certain periods or whatever, they don't have that money. Their parents do not have that money. And for as long, and what has happened is that we have put them through the system, and now we are holding them back with the change of the student debt, and they are not able to participate in the very economy that they should be able to contribute towards. So there's no other viable solution except to write off that student debt, and we think that there can be money to write off that student debt. That 18 billion rand can be found, and we can write it off in tranches. We are not saying it must be written off in 2 months, in a year's time. We can write it off in 2 years, we can write it off in 3 years. But 18 billion rand, we definitely are able to afford as a country to write off that student debt and ensure that those students are participating in the economy of the country.
Dr. Linda, failure to do so, what will it mean for the sustainability of the institutions?
Well, obviously universities need to remain as going concerns, and we've always said that we need policy stability. So whatever government does, public institutions, public universities are owned by government. So this is not just the university's problems. This is the problem of government. So we need to find a systemic solution. So whether this is that government underwrites the debt, because nothing can be done by universities without policy being enacted, without legislation being enacted for them to enable them so that they can deal with this particular student debt. So certainly we need to start engaging critically, because this debt is not decreasing. It is decreasing. It is increasing exponentially annually, and we can no longer turn a blind eye and kick the can down the road. It is something that we need to pay particular attention to, because our economy needs these skills. We need the graduates, and we need to ensure that universities remain sustainable as going concerns.
Universities and student movement speaking with one voice, at least, on the debt cancellation or the debt write-off. Of course, some of the other issues are still contested. That's where we leave it for tonight. Much appreciated, and thank you for your engagement on 072-110-5584. In Focus continues with more stories making headlines tonight here on the channel.